I'm speaking to you from this section, this north-south reach of the river below the Palisades. And you can see this is the Tinicum watershed shown here. And if we go to look at a larger scale view within our section of the watershed in Bucks County, here's the Tinicum watershed in orange, and Cooks Creek, an exceptional resource value stream up here, Tinicum Creek to the east of the Tinicum, another EV stream, and down here the largest subwatershed in Bucks County, the Neshaminy. The Neshaminy, interestingly, up here we have two exceptional resource value, highest water quality streams, and the Tinicum, which has for 21 years been fighting a battle to become an EV stream. And the Neshaminy, just below, is one of the most heavily impacted streams in the state from non-point source pollution. It's getting better, but it used to be the #1 stream in the state for impacts. And easy to understand, southern Bucks County is much more highly populated than we are here in beautiful Upper Bucks. Going at a still larger mapping scale, here's the Tinicum watershed. And the thing that I would like to point out here, one of the things that's mapped here are what are called hydric soils. Those are soils that tend to have wetlands in them. And you can see that the distribution of hydric soils in the upper part of the Tinicum watershed is pretty extensive, whereas in the lower portion of the watershed on the right here, the east, not so much. And the difference is due to the underlying geology. Up here, Haycock Mountain area and Geigel Hill over here. This area is underlain by a rock formation called the diabase. And the diabase is a magma, lava flow that intruded and popped up to the surface and then solidified millions of years ago. And it's a very hard, dense rock. It's also a common name is trap rock because it's difficult to put a well into. And it's also difficult to put a septic system on. You may, just from your travels, realize how much lighter the density of housing is around Haycock Mountain and on top of Geigel Hill than down in the valley here in the southeast. And so part of the reason there are hydric soils up here is because water tends to perch on top of that rock formation. And so groundwater tables are high. And there are also what are called perched water tables where the water simply sits, the rock may be so close to the surface that the water doesn't drain off it. Whereas in the southeastern portion of the Tinicum, the underlying rock formation is the Brunswick Shale. And the shale is solidified mud, basically, and oftentimes in our area is fairly fractured. And the fractures allow the water to percolate through it. So you don't tend to have as many hydric soils on top of the shale as you do. You also get differences, major differences in vegetation. Interestingly, on top of the diabase, one of the dominant trees in the forest there is tulip poplar. On the shale, there are no tulip poplar. If you look in the southern part of Tinicum Township, you won't find any tulip poplars growing on top of the shale. And at a still larger mapping scale, this is part of the Tinicum Creek watershed. It's not the entire watershed. Over here on the left side, if you can see my cursor, there are two streams, Beaver Creek and Rap Creek, that are actually headwater streams, and where they, at their confluence, is the start of actual named Tinicum Creek, although Beaver and Rap are both parts of the Tinicum Creek watershed. But one of the interesting things here is that, again, where you see the hydric soils up here on the top part of the screen, That's the diabase on Geigel Hill. And then from Van Zandt Airport down to the river, we're in the Brunswick Shale. And an interesting feature within the shale, the blue lines are all perennial streams. But all of these streaks of gray are ravines, very deep ravines in the shale that are intermittent stream channels. And they have flowing water in them, typically from, say, November, late November through April. And we have one of these ravines on our property, and it's had flowing water in it now since November, frozen recently, but thawing out again in the last few days. So that's a very interesting geologic feature where you can see all of these deep ravines that are formed in the shale as a result of the characteristics of the erosion of that particular bedrock type. The main feature of watersheds associated with the streams that are the main attributes of watersheds are what are called riparian corridors. And the riparian corridor is basically the area including and adjacent to the stream, typically the floodplain and areas related to the floodplain, maybe slopes beyond the edge of the floodplain. So here's a diagram of a typical cross-section of a riparian zone. And as it turns out, floodplains have characteristic vegetation types. For example, down along the Delaware, if you drive along River Road, you see a lot of trees with patches of white bark on them. Those are sycamores. That's a very typical floodplain tree. Doesn't tend to grow up on upland areas. It's always usually associated with water. It tolerates flooding. Silver maple and river birch, two other dominant trees that you find in the floodplain. And of course, where you have wetlands associated with those stream channels, the wetlands have typical vegetation too. And then across the bottom are a variety of animals, many of which are closely linked to riparian corridors. And one interesting thing about riparian corridors, a lot of research has shown that the wider the riparian corridor is that's associated with a stream, and typically these are naturally vegetated corridors, the wider that corridor is, the higher the biodiversity is that's associated with that stream corridor. And so in an agricultural area, say heavily agricultural like Lancaster County, the riparian corridors tend to be really narrow, and oftentimes farming takes place right up to the stream. And historically, that's led to some severe impacts downstream in Chesapeake Bay because of sediment runoff due to farming practices. So the wider the riparian corridor is, the better. And there are some typical species associated with corridors, as I mentioned, and along the Delaware River, this has become a typical species along the Delaware, our national symbol, the bald eagle. For those of you unfamiliar, bald eagle was listed as an endangered species for 4 decades. And back in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, there were only 2 nesting pairs of eagles in the entire state of Pennsylvania. They were both at Pymatuning Reservoir in northwestern Pennsylvania up toward Erie. 2 years ago, there were 335 nesting pairs of bald eagles in Pennsylvania. And they are regularly spaced up and down the entire Delaware River drainage now. And it's pretty neat to have them as almost a yard bird that you can see fairly regularly in our area now. Another typical species in riparian corridors is the mink. And mink are a pretty good carnivore and a really good indication of the health of the ecosystem, being a top-line predator. And we'll get back to the mink a little later. But I said I was going to talk about some of the impacts of human populations and development, and here's one. This is a riparian corridor in Malvern, Pennsylvania. Here's the relatively unimpacted riparian corridor back here, but there's a stream that was flowing underneath this parking lot for almost 40 years. And interestingly, this is a FEMA certified floodplain. We'll get back to this a bit later, but the Federal Emergency Management Act classified this as a floodplain. Not a lot of biological value there. So what are some of the impacts of urban runoff where we have areas with lots of development, lots of roads, lots of parking, lots of housing, excuse me, or agricultural areas where there's a lot of fertilizer and pesticide use and plowing? Well, sediment runoff is really common. I mentioned the impacts to Chesapeake Bay from Lancaster County and other areas of farming historically in the Susquehanna drainage. Nutrient runoff, again, from fertilizers. Oxygen demand, when there's a lot of fertilizer in the water, there's a lot of plant growth and algae growth, and that sucks the oxygen out of the water. Bacteria from historically from discharges from sewage treatment plants. Trace metals, chlorides, salt put down during the wintertime, washes into streams. Thermal loading, think of that parking lot we just looked at in the summertime and how hot it gets. And if it rains on that and runs into a stream, it's going to be hot water. And also historically, not so much anymore, oil and grease. Cars used to drip a lot of oil. They're much better now and don't tend to leak oil as much as they used to. But that used to be a common impact to receiving waters as well. And all of those things that I just listed were what are called non-point source pollutants. So they occur across the landscape to varying degrees. This pipe illustrates what are called point discharges. So typically associated with industrial sites that are washing off equipment or something like that and would discharge into a receiving water. And that's tended to have been cleaned up quite a bit too in recent years. But one of the things that also happens, regardless of the pollutant load, is simply the amount of water that is generated by increases in impervious coverage. If the water can't drain into the ground right away and get back to the groundwater, and it's runs off on streets or parking lots and into a pipe and is discharged directly into the stream, which is classically the case in urban areas like Philadelphia. And where I grew up in Havertown in Delaware County, first township west of City Line Avenue in Philadelphia. I grew up in a subdivision that was built right after World War II, and all the water ran down the street into a pipe and was piped more than a half a mile and discharged directly into Darby Creek. And so historically, that's the way stormwater was managed. But associated with all that impervious coverage, we get more runoff from a given size rainfall, and that increases what civil engineers call the peak runoff. And when you get higher peak runoff, you get erosion. And so what's illustrated here, and this is from northeastern Philadelphia, is a bank that was very stable and well vegetated and covered with soil has over time eroded away. And as you go around this little meander bend here, you can see there's a very steep eroded slope. So this is one of the problems with urban and suburban streams historically, is that we had much higher volumes of runoff associated with human development that had severe impacts of erosion in some of our streams. Also, cutting, agriculture, this could just as well be an agricultural field. close to a stream. This happens to be in central New Jersey. This is the south branch of the Raritan River, a Category 1 trout stream, highest classification in New Jersey. And this area was illegally cut. Fortunately, all the stumps were left, and root suckers and stump sprouts sprouted immediately, and it grew back like this opposite bank. Plus the township required the perpetrator to plant trees along this bank, and it quickly stabilized after several years. But the water was exposed where it formerly had been shaded, and so you would get potential impacts of heat. Golf courses have lots of cleared land, lots of mowed lawn, and in terms of attenuating runoff, lawns are not real high in the spectrum. Pavement is the worst. In civil engineering, there are what are called runoff coefficients that are used to calculate stormwater runoff and to design attenuation of stormwater runoff. And for example, pavement has a runoff coefficient almost 1. Lawns are around 0.7 or 0.8. Meadows, a little lower. Shrublands, lower still. And the best vegetation cover for attenuating runoff and absorbing water are forests. And this obviously is not a forest. One good thing that golf courses have done over the years is instead of what they used to do where they would run around with a vehicle and spread fertilizer or pesticide across this landscape, they now use a technique called fertigation, where the fertilizer or the herbicide that's being used to keep the lawn 100% grass and growing is sprayed through the irrigation system, and it's metered out and in measured amounts, and it's a much better system than it used to be, but that still doesn't absolve golf courses of some of their sins. One of which is mowing right up to the edge of streams. And as you can see here, that results in erosion. One of the problems is that a lot of golf courses, especially out of play areas, are composed of what are called cool season grasses. It's a turf grass, the kind of grass you have on your lawn that greens up in the spring, and then in the summer goes dormant when it gets real hot, and then in the fall starts growing again. You get to mow it again. That's a cool season grass. Cool season grasses typically have fairly shallow root systems, so they're not real good at preventing erosion like we see here. So the better solution here would be to have a buffer zone on either side with a lot more plant growth that filters the runoff before it gets to this water. So we've looked at some of the potential impacts of human populations and associated development. And I'd like to spend the remainder of the time looking at some of the techniques that have been developed to try and attenuate runoff and improve water quality within the watersheds we live in. So we'll start off in the uplands. And this is real uplands here. This is a paint pigment manufacturing facility near Paterson, New Jersey, owned by Bayer Corporation. This factory was in operation for almost 100 years. And in looking at this air photo here in the upper left, that is a process waste pond that's full of volatile organic chemicals left over from processing paint pigment. And this is an unlined pond, and the water is leaching down into the groundwater. And right here on the upper side of this slide is a stream corridor, and the homes on the other side of the stream corridor are all on wells. They are not on city water. So Bayer recognized their potential problem here and figured that EPA was going to declare them a Superfund site before very long. So Bayer took it upon themselves in the late 80s to design a closure plan for this facility The main building here was a very nice brick building from the early 1900s. They donated that to the borough of Haledon as their municipal building. They drained this pond and sent all the waste to a Superfund landfill site, a toxic waste dump. They then put a cap on this area and covered it with 44 mil thick polyethylene. It was like a giant trash bag over top of this site. And it has close to, I forget the exact number, almost 100 wells on it that are drawing out water and vapor and are put into a $1 million treatment plant that's on site. And the water that comes out is cleaner than the water in this stream and is put back into the stream. And originally, excuse me, originally Bayer was planning to, their first alternative was they were going to put asphalt over the entire 12 acres of this cap because that was the lowest maintenance thing they could think of. But fortunately, they happened to see a PBS program on the closure of the Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island. Fresh Kills was the world's largest landfill. It was on Staten Island. And when it was closed, it was covered with a clay cap and topsoil and planted with native plants and seeded with native grasses. And some representatives from Bayer who were in charge of this project saw that and said, maybe that's a better idea than putting asphalt on this. And so this was the ultimate cap. The white strips that you see are the locations of the wells where the vapor and water are being drawn from. And this was about 3 years after this was installed, native grass and wildflower mix. We added some berms, 1 to 2 foot high berms, to allow planting of woodies on here. And so these were early successional woodlands that were put in. And the berms allowed us to break up the cap. It looked like a moonscape originally, very flat. But once these plants were put in, much better looking. This has been in place for almost 30 years now. And deer got in, and as you can imagine, they ate a lot of the woodies. The main tree that's still left on this site is eastern red cedar, but the grasses are still there. A lot of the wildflowers are gone. The deer ate those, but it's still, it's only mowed once a year. The site is part of the Wildlife Habitat Council, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to corporate lands, enhancing wildlife habitat. And it's been a very successful project for a long time. And in the best sense of field of dreams, if you build it, they will come. Lots of wildlife on the site. Song sparrow, a common species, but native, cardinal, and even American woodcock, game bird, use this site during migration. They don't happen to nest there, but they are there during migration. And a number of other birds use this site routinely. There are also fox on the site, and coyotes have been sighted, and 1 year a bobcat. And this is in suburban Paterson, New Jersey. So pretty interesting site. Another major impact that I alluded to earlier was the effects of stormwater runoff on watersheds. And originally, when those effects were recognized and regulations were passed to try and do something about stormwater impacts, the main effect that was addressed was the volume of runoff. I talked about the fact that the larger and larger the storm, the higher the peak runoff associated with it. And it's the peak runoff that produces the flooding downstream that we often see in urban watersheds. And so initially, efforts to attenuate were there to attenuate flood flows. And the way that was done was to build what are called detention basins. And the idea was that you'd pipe the water into a pit, basically a moon crater, and bleed the water out slowly over time. And so that would reduce or attenuate that peak that would occur after a storm event. And you'd still have the same amount of water being generated, but the release of it to the stream would be spread out over time. This is one kind of structure that was used to do that. This one actually has a water quality feature, which I'll discuss in a minute. That's this lower rectangular, horizontally flattened opening here. But originally, the idea was simply to try and control flood flows. And this is a weir structure, which is a kind of concrete structure that's placed in a berm at one end of a basin, at the downstream end of a basin. And the water would fill up, whoops, let me back that one up. The water would fill up behind this concrete structure, and there's an earthen berm on either side here. And when the water got to a certain elevation, it would bleed out of this orifice, which in the early designs of weirs would have been a single notch that went all the way down to here. After a period of time, there were studies done that looked at the pollutant loads associated with these storms, and it was recognized that that this type of a weir that I was describing, with only one notch and that was designed just to control flood flows, didn't really address the problem of non-point source pollutants. And the study showed that that 95% or more of all the pollutant loads were associated with what are called first flush storms. Those are the smaller storms that occur frequently. So imagine during the summer, you have a roadway and there's no rainfall on that roadway for a couple of weeks. And sediments accumulate from the cars passing and or driving on the shoulder and throwing sediment out onto the road. Heavy metals from rust on vehicles, again, not as common today, and oil accumulation. And then you get a rain event. And maybe it's a half an inch of rain over the course of a day. And that washes those sediments, associated heavy metals and oils, off the road and into a receiving body of water or into a detention basin. There isn't sufficient time, the way these were originally designed, for the water to settle or be quiet and let these sediments settle out. And so the idea then became, okay, we'll create a control structure that addresses this small design storm and lets that water out very slowly over time. And that's what this is called. This smaller orifice down below is a water quality orifice, so that when there's a small design storm, and in speaking about design storms, let me back up for a second. Engineers talk about design storms with a frequency with which they return. And so, for example, a one-year design storm is a storm that occurs about once a year on average, and it's roughly 1.25 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. A two-year design storm, for example, is 2.25 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. Storms up to 100 years, a 100-year storm is once in 100 years. But with global warming, we now get 100-year storms about every 4 or 5 years. So there's a lot going on with the weather. But the idea of these small design storms was to use a water quality orifice, whether in this type of a weir in a dam, or a standpipe with different size holes in it, or a box with holes at different elevations, small hole at the bottom, larger hole above, to release the water slowly over time, while also controlling for larger design storms that cause flooding. even after these water quality issues began to be addressed by the structures that were included in detention basins, it then became recognized that if you had, rather than a mowed basin, which was the typical early style, if you had a naturalized basin with a meadow in it, for example, of native plants, that you got even better water quality. Vegetation such as you see here, that was installed in this basin at McNeil Consumer Products, people that make Tylenol down in Fort Washington near the Turnpike. This slows the flows of water still more and causes sediment to drop out. If there's oil in the water, it gets trapped on the leaves of the plants and breaks down photochemically, biologically, biochemically, and mechanically. So there's a lot of benefits to having a vegetated basin. This is another such basin. This is an older style basin with a single orifice here just for quantity management. This is at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture headquarters in Harrisburg, right across the street from the farm show arena, if you know where that is on Cameron Street. If you've ever been to the farm show arena for the home show or the ag show, the farm show. This basin had two native seed mixes put into it. One was for the upland slopes, these well-drained dry slopes, and another one was a seed mix that included plants that were better adapted for frequent flooding and a little wetter bottom down here in the lowest portion of the basin. And in addition to the seed mixes, there were plugs of native plants that were put in, and all of this was done by the staff of the Department of Agriculture. And this was a demonstration basin, and they put this sign up that explained what had been done here. And this was designed to show best management practices for stormwater. And even in a very small basin like this, which was well under 1/4 of an acre, you still have a miniature ecosystem there. And if you look in this photograph, there's quite a bit going on. In addition to the flowers, this is echinacea, purple coneflower. There's gaillardia down here, and up on the upper right is wild bergamot. For those of you Earl Grey tea fans, that's the secret ingredient in Earl Grey tea is bergamot. And on the left here is a eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly, a spangled fritillary, and a bumblebee on this particular flower. So there's quite a bit going on in this downsized ecosystem. The other place that all of these techniques were applied almost virtually universally now was in subdivisions. And as I mentioned, the subdivision I grew up in the 50s had the stormwater management was run it down the street, put it in a pipe and send it right to the stream. And that's not done anymore. Basins are a common part of all developments these days. This happens to be a naturalized basin in Long Valley, New Jersey, and central New Jersey is a township that I've been the environmental consultant for 30 years. And we got applicants to do either wetland basins like this one, you can see the cattails that are growing in here, or dry basins that were well vegetated. And these systems are very good at attenuating both flood flows and providing water quality benefits. And it turned out that among best management practices that were developed in the years following the Clean Water Act, these are called wet ponds, or in the engineering vernacular, retention basins rather than detention basins. Wet ponds have among the highest pollutant removal efficiencies of any best management practice. And this is a wetland treatment system pond on a commercial development by Tornetta Realty on Germantown Pike in Norristown. And this actually was a historic pond that was on this site. And we convinced Pennsylvania DEP that we could actually, that pond was all silted in and was in bad shape. And we convinced DEP that we could make it a better pond, enlarge it, and use it as part of this stormwater management system. And you can see the extensive wetlands that are around here. There were also what are called biofilters that pre-treated the runoff that came off the roads and off of this site. This was a 100-room hotel that was built on the site. There were also some office buildings that included the headquarters of the former Clemens Markets that was purchased by Giant. That's all the good news. The sad news is that this site, this particular basin, was not well maintained, was invaded by Phragmites, the common reed, and is now mostly a monoculture of Phragmites, which is unfortunate. It's not no maintenance. It could be low maintenance, but you have to do some maintenance. Now, all that being said, the current state of the art in stormwater management is what are called infiltration basins. And the idea there is to put the water back in the ground as close to the source as possible. You've probably all heard of rain gardens. Rain gardens are a type of infiltration basin where you can take runoff from your downspout from your house or from off of your driveway and put it into a kind of a miniature wetland that has a sand filter underneath it. And here's the sand filter shown down here in the sand colored, gritty appearing texture. And the idea, as the blue arrows indicate, is that the stormwater comes in, you have a well-vegetated basin. These could be even shrublands or forested in some cases. And with this sand layer, the water tends to percolate through, and then you need another couple of feet of good soil underneath these to allow the water to get back into the groundwater. And if you have so much water that it can't all percolate during the time that the water's in the basin, this is the overflow structure that allows the water to discharge from the basin. So that's the current state of the art. And here's an example. This was out in Wisconsin. And as you can see, you can nicely vegetate these basins and make them a really interesting part of the landscape, as opposed to the original design of detention basins, which was, as I said, kind of a moon crater that's mowed every week. So another key element in any watershed are the wetlands in that watershed. Wetlands often occur in upper portions of the streams that constitute the watershed. They often are the headwaters, and where the wetlands coalesce into a stream, that becomes the headwaters stream for the watershed. And wetlands historically were viewed unfavorably by humans during heavy development. For evidence, all you need to do is look at where all the major airports are along the East Coast. Every one of them is located in a tidal marsh. Kennedy, LaGuardia, Newark, Philadelphia, they're all on former tidal marshes that were filled because they're nice flat ground and those wetlands aren't really doing anything. So turns out that more than 50% of all the wetlands in the United States have been destroyed. And fortunately, following the Clean Water Act, there's been a policy of no net loss of wetlands. And so there have been lots of efforts to rehabilitate damaged wetlands or impaired wetlands and or create new wetlands for various reasons. So we'll take a look at a few of those. First of all, why are wetlands so valuable? Well, if you recall the list of all the impacts of urban runoff, wetlands address every one of those. They retain sediments, they trap heavy metals, they absorb nutrients, they reduce biological and chemical oxygen demand, they reduce hydrocarbons, and in addition, they provide great wildlife habitat. So if you're going to create a wetland, what's the most important consideration? Well, it's not called a wetland because it's dry. So you need to know where's the water coming from. And if you're repairing a wetland or restoring one, you probably have the water source available. But if you're creating a new one, it's really important to understand where is the water coming from. And when you look at wetland hydrology, there are basically two types of wetlands. And I alluded to them when we were talking about the geology of our area before. There are groundwater fed wetlands where the groundwater is roughly within half a foot of the surface during a significant portion of the growing season, which fosters a plant community that's adapted to having its feet wet. And there are perched water tables or perched water wetlands where there's some type of confining layer below the surface. It could be the diabase where the rock is near the surface and the water simply can't get through the soil into the groundwater. Or it could be a case where you have a confining layer in the soil, what's called a fragipan, which is a dense layer of compacted soil, typically 15 to 30 inches below the surface. And among wetland types for creation, perched water tables are the bigger challenge. So let's start with one of those. This was a site in central New Jersey. The area to the right here in the forest is wetland. And in the background here, there's a road where this truck is that runs down along the edge of the woods here and crosses the stream. There's a stream in this woods. And an online detention basin was placed on that stream. That was the last online detention basin allowed by the state of New Jersey, meaning you can't build a detention facility directly on a stream anymore. You have to build a separate facility. So the township required this developer to do mitigation for the wetlands that were damaged by that construction of that stormwater facility. But this was the wetlands in the woods were a perched water table, and they were on top of a soil called califon. And califon has a fragipan, a dense confining layer that causes the water to perch on top of it during late winter and early spring during runoff. And so we had to design a wetland that mimicked that included a fragipan as a mimic of what was in the adjacent wetland. So what was done was this area was excavated and a layer of native clay soils was put down and gone over with a sheep's foot roller, a large heavy compactor like you would see a steamroller on a roadway, to compact that clay layer. And at the edge of it was a trench was placed that was a little deeper, but also lined with clay. And then 12 inches of topsoil was placed on top of that clay liner. And water was directed from a pond that was upstream on the same stream and metered out at 1 gallon per minute into this stone-filled trench with a perforated pipe in it. And this pipe was not perforated to carry the water to here. And then the perforated pipe was placed in here. So water was fed into the trench, it filled up the trench, and then the subsurface clay layer was at a 0.5% grade, so the water flowed left to right. So after it was installed, this is what it looked like, with the water flowing through it, and trees and shrubs were planted on it, and a seed mix was put down. And this is what it looked like 15 years later. Very successful perched water table. You can see some cattails formed in here. We're in the wettest area. And this was the same area in that same fall. And another field of dreams, 3 years after this was installed, I was doing an inspection on this property, came along the edge of where that trench is and found this painted turtle laying eggs right next to the wetland. And there were lots of other good things that were using that. That wetland is now almost 30 years old and still very successful. Another resident of the wetland, a garden spider. And even places like golf courses provide opportunities for wetland restoration. This is Hamilton Farms Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, site of the 5-time site of the World's Women Match Play Championships. And the area in the foreground, water was being drained into this area off this fairway that you can see here and off a fairway that's behind us viewing this. And it was eroded, an eroded channel, and very problematic. But after it was restored, it looked like this and has been very successful since then. And this area was just upstream of where that eroded stream channel was. And we also got them to do buffer plantings along that stream, and that also has become stabilized. And lastly, I'd like to look at some stream restoration projects. The stormwater management came first in terms of recognition of things that needed to be done to improve watershed quality. The wetland restoration came second, and stream restoration is relatively recent, mostly within the last 20 years or so. And so the first case study is, you saw this slide before, this happens to be Little Valley Creek, which is down in Chester County, and is a tributary to Valley Creek, which is itself a tributary to the Schuylkill River. And this is located, earlier we looked at this segment right here of the Delaware and where we are with Tinicum Creek and the Tinicum. And now we're going to move down to Chester County down here. And here is the Valley Creek watershed. The confluence of Valley Creek and the Schuylkill is up here on the upper right. The main stem of Valley Creek goes back up this way, westward in Chester County. Here's the Route 202 corridor through the middle. And Little Valley Creek is mostly on the south side of 202. And the segment that we're going to look at is right here, just below the Route 29 corridor. And if you're familiar at all with the Route 202 corridor, Penn State Great Valley campus is right in here. And Malvern is down here along Route 30. And what's shown here are what are called different orders of streams within this basin. And the reddish brown here is first order streams. And a first order stream is a perennial stream that has no other perennial tributaries. And a second order stream, as you might suspect, is where you have the confluence of two first order streams. Below that, that's a second order stream. And then down here, the kind of khaki green is the third order portion, where you've got multiple first and second order streams converging. And just as a kind of a measure of the complexity and the size of watersheds, the river system with the highest order of basins is the Amazon, not surprisingly. The Amazon is the world's largest river system. And the main stem of the Amazon at the lower end is a 12th order stream. So here's a view of this stream corridor. Now we're on the north side looking south across Route 202, which is down here at the bottom. This is the National Rolling Mills steel mill that was on this site for 40 years. and under which a 1,000-foot segment of Little Valley Creek was placed in a pipe. And the steel mill went out of business, was abandoned. The site was purchased by a brownfield developer, O'Neill Property Group. And now in this one, 202 is at the top. So that's north at the top of the picture. And Route 29 is over here on the left. And the plan was to do what's called a town center with commercial and residential and a couple of big boxes. And this one on the left turned out to be Wegmans, and the second one from the left turned out to be Target. And this central section has been redesigned a number of times since the recession. But originally it was proposed to look like this, and with commercial on the first floor and residential on the second floor. It was actually designed to mimic an area called Suburban Square in Ardmore on Route 30, if you're at all familiar with that section. So here we are back to our parking lot. This was the parking lot of the steel mill. And as I said, this is a FEMA certified floodplain. And the steel mill has been torn down, but this was the area when the parking lot was still there. And Little Valley Creek was in a pipe underneath the parking lot, but there was a big problem. The pipe wasn't nearly big enough to handle all the things that floated down the stream, and so it became clogged. And so the parking lot flooded regularly because the flood flows were much too big to get into this pipe. So how does one go about restoring a stream where there is no stream and the stream is straight and it's in a pipe? Well, in designing streams, the main technique that's used is to pick a segment, a relatively unimpaired segment of the same stream in the same area, and do measurements on that stream of all its characteristics so that you can design a stream that mimics what's already there. And so this is what's called the reference reach for Little Valley Creek. This was upstream of the site that I just showed you. And so what typically is done, that the defining feature of any stream is the bank full flow. And the bank full flow is when there's a storm event of a size that fills up the channel to the top of the bank, but not overflowing the bank. And it turns out that that particular flow is what does the most to shape all the characteristics of the stream and the channel. So the first thing to do is, okay, what's the bank full width? What's the height of the bank? What's the width of what is called the flood prone area, which is similar to the floodplain, but not quite. So how wide is the floodplain? What's the characteristics of the channel? What's the pool to riffle ratio? How much of the channel have pools in it, and how much of it is riffles? What's the distance between pools, the pool to pool distance? What's the meander ratio? How curvy is the stream? What's the composition of the bottom of the stream? So you do something called a pebble count, where you do transects going across the stream, and every 2 feet you pick up a pebble or whatever the bottom composition is. And that gives you the size of material, as you can see in the foreground here, that tends to be in the stream bottom. So when you're rebuilding the stream, all these characteristics go into designing the stream. So after doing all those measurements, this is what resulted. Turns out that this stream is in a very flat, has a very flat gradient. And the flatter the gradient, the more meander bends there are in it. Think if you've ever been in the Poconos and been along one of those tumbling streams in the Poconos, they're on very steep gradients, and it's one pool splashes down into another pool, splashes down into another pool. Well, the opposite of that is the flatter the floodplain gets, the more meander bends are in it. So it turns out that Little Valley Creek is a highly meandering stream with about 160-foot wide floodplain. Well, unfortunately, 160-foot wide floodplain wasn't what the developer had in mind. So we ended up with about 110 feet maximum. So the floodplain was only about 2/3. So here's what the floodplain looked like on the right-hand side here, down below the project, a very much wider floodplain that would have been ideal. So we ended up with this. And plus, in the middle of the site, there was going to be a grand entrance bridge crossing, and they wanted a very narrow section here that was only 40 feet wide. Now, the Department of Environmental Protection for Pennsylvania, DEP, and the Army Corps of Engineers were the two lead regulatory agencies on this. And they both said, no, you can't have 300 feet of that narrow a floodplain. We'll give you whatever it ended up being, 200 perhaps. But they did allow for the narrowed floodplain elsewhere. That's problematic. The stream wants a wider floodplain. So down here on the lower left is a cross section of what the future floodplain would look like, with the stream shown cut into it and the plantings that were proposed. So before you can build the new stream, what are you going to do with the existing stream? You're going to take it out of the pipe that it was in, but you can't have it running through the site while you're trying to build the new channel. So the first thing to do was to bypass the area where the stream was going to be constructed. So this 5-foot diameter corrugated plastic pipe was put in and was pushed and routed under where the development was going to occur on the south side of the site, and ran the full length of the site. And there was this diversion berm that was put in here so that during flood events, the water would go into this pipe and bypass the site and come out at the bottom end while we were working on the site. So here's the area where the stream was going to go. This is looking the opposite direction of that shot, looking up the parking lot. This is looking east. And so this is after the pipe has been taken out, the stream's been diverted, and they're excavating down to the original floodplain grade. This is months later. And so here we have the finished graded new floodplain. The stream channel has been put in, but what's this? Walls. The entire project, the engineers, the civil engineers, designed to be at the same grade as the adjacent road. So they didn't want to have to excavate out a lot of material and have a site that was where all the buildings were located down below the road. So they built up the area to maintain it at the height of the adjacent roads. And that meant that the floodplain and the stream were going to be down in a pit at their original elevation. And so we have this keystone block wall all the way around the entire site. And at the upper end, where the stream is at a higher elevation, the walls are about 7 or 8 feet high. And as the stream flows downhill and the grades get lower and lower, but the wall and everything above it stays at the same elevation. At the lower end of the project, the wall is 14 feet high. So here we are looking back upstream, the same view as the parking lot view. And here's our riparian corridor where the stream is outside of the pipe originally. And now this is where the pipe used to flow through here. And now here's our meandering stream channel in this upper segment. And what's shown here in the background, this pile, when this was excavated and got down to final grade, we were into subsoil. And the subsoil had very little organics in it and wasn't going to be very good to grow plants. So we needed to make a topsoil. And this product is called biosolids compost. It's composed of human waste mixed with wood chips. It's EPA and USDA regulated. It has known organic content. It has known nutrient levels. And best of all, it has no seed bank. If you used mushroom compost or you used leaf compost, you get lots of seeds of things that you may not want in your project. The only seeds in this human waste devised compost are tomato seeds, which pass through the human gut undigested. So we had a few tomato plants show up, but no problem. So here's the channel with a gravel cobble bottom to match what was in the reference reach. Right here is what's called a rock vein. These are put in periodically to help the water get around the curves and reduce the stress and erosive capabilities of the water during a storm event on the curves. And lots of bioengineering here. These are coconut fiber logs that are put in to help stabilize the base of the bank. And this is a coconut straw blanket so that when this bank is seeded and that bank and the blanket is flipped up over it, that'll help stabilize the bank while the plants are growing in. So there were, I didn't point them out, but there were 3 bridge crossings on this, top, middle, and bottom, to get from the adjacent road into the site. This is the lowest bridge crossing. Each one of these segments that compose this bridge weighs 58,000 pounds. And with the block and tackle on this, that this crane is picking up, it's 32 tons, 64,000 pounds. So these obviously had to be carefully placed on these footers, and they were. And here's a view from the bottom end of the project, and you can see down here where the walls are really high and the stream is at a lower elevation, there's a lot of room under here for flood flows to get through. This is a section where this is the narrow section where the floodplain is only 40 feet wide. And you can see the height here isn't quite as much as it is here. Here it's 12 feet, here it's only 9. And of course, here's the stream coming down through here. And this is a shot taken during planting of all the trees and shrubs. And here we are in May during the tree and shrub planting. And this is taken from the upper end. This is the footer in the foreground of the uppermost bridge. Here's that central bridge viewed from the other side and now installed and pretty much completed. And here's the lower segment, also in May. Trees are installed, haven't yet hydroseeded the seed mixes yet. This was May 20th. Okay, where did the water come from? We're routing the stream around the site, but there's water already in the channel. Well, remember, this is a trout production stream. And the reason it's a trout production stream is it's because it's in a limestone formation that's full of springs. And since we got the elevations right in grading the channel, we encountered some of those springs. And the water started flowing in the channel before we were finished. And in fact, to construct part of this channel, we had to set up 2 4-inch pumps and pump 24/7 to get the water out of the channel so we could actually complete the channel. And then came June 9th. The hydroseeding was done around June 1st. So the hydroseeding was done 1 week before this big storm event. We got 3 inches of rainfall in 2 hours. And this is the diversion berm that's supposed to hold back the floodwaters and direct all the water into this 5-foot diameter pipe, which is right over here out of sight. Not enough. The storm blew out this diversion berm, and this is the uppermost bridge that's mostly installed. Water blowing through there and down into the previously planted area. And here's the view from the bottom end. And the good news is the channel design worked pretty well. The water stayed in the channel and then overflowed into the floodplain without too much velocity. But the fear was that we had hydroseeded so recently that this was going to wipe out the effort of seeding, and plus how much soil gets eroded from this. Well, it turned out it wasn't too bad. And this was a month later, and the seeding worked and is coming in, and the erosion wasn't too bad, and all the plants are still alive. So things are going pretty well. And here we are another month later in August of 2009, and you can see everything is growing in. Here's one of these rock veins. And what happens is when the water flows in a storm event and fills up the channel, the way this is angled, the water tends to flow up this incline and fall toward the center of the channel, away from this bank, so that the bank doesn't get eroded. And again, this is before the water's been entered into the channel. This is all spring-fed flow right here. And the plants started working. Joe Pye weed in bloom here, bee balm, and the shrubs doing pretty well. The deer were excluded at this point. And another field of dreams, you build it, and up comes a pickerel frog. And a wild indigo dusky winged butterfly. And this guy, which I could not identify immediately, took home, keyed out, and it turns out to be a twin spot sphinx moth caterpillar. Ah, yes, money, the root of everything. So we got most of the stream in. We hadn't hooked it up yet. It was the idea was to let the channel grow in for a year before we hooked it up. But recall that that last photograph was August 20th of 2009. And if you all recall, that was right around when the recession hit. So O'Neill was about to go for their next tranche of loan. They had originally gotten their loan from Citizens Bank, a local bank. They were going for another loan. They had done their infrastructure. They were now going to start building buildings. Bank of Scotland, 2 months before, had purchased Citizens Bank. And when the recession hit, Bank of Scotland said, we're not going to give you the money. So the entire project went on hold for more than 2 years. During that time, especially in 2011, when the Corps of Engineers said, you need to get this finished, I don't care if you're out of money or not, you need to finish this. Right about the time that we were about to start again, if you recall, there were the remnants of 2 hurricanes went through, Irene and Lee. This is what Irene did to the diversion berm at the top end, completely blew it out. All of that material washed downstream, and we had to go down there with a small front end loader and clean out the channel all the way down and regrade, and then finish grade this area. And here's where the stream is on the other side, the original stream, up gradient. And we finally reconnected this in October of 2011. And the good news is that within 5 weeks after reconnecting the stream and water flowing through the site, there were trout back in the stream, which was the whole point of the exercise. This is a year later, in 2012, the upper end of the site above the upper bridge. And this is the area that had been growing in since 2009. So this was technically 3 years after construction. This is a variety of American elm, disease-resistant variety, sycamore, and river birch. So all good floodplain species here, and working very well. And again, field of dreams, if you build it. That's the nest of a goldfinch in a black haw viburnum, growing right near the cinder block wall, the keystone block wall. This is on the lower segment, this third season, blue flag iris growing in, the trees and shrubs doing very well, stable banks. And this is a good riparian corridor. And in riparian corridors, you get willow flycatcher, yellow warbler. And the one year we even had blue grosbeak. I had never seen a blue grosbeak before, but they nested, this one built a nest in one of the sycamores that was overhanging the stream. It's pretty cool. And because we were now hooked up and downstream to existing stream corridors, we had foxes in the corridor, great horned owls, one of the top predators, and these guys. Those are the tracks of the mink. This corridor is full of mink. Because this stream is a cold water stream because of the springs, it has a tremendous crayfish population, and crayfish are the prime food item for mink. So I saw mink in person several times while I was monitoring this after construction, but I was never fast enough with the camera to get a picture of one. So from Little Valley Creek to a much larger stream, this is the Mill River in Stamford, Connecticut. This is downtown Stamford, Connecticut. This Lowhead Dam was a 200-year-old dam that was on the Mill River, just above Long Island Sound. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to remove this dam to allow anadromous fish passage. Anadromous fish are ones that live in the ocean and migrate upriver to spawn, like Atlantic salmon and shad that we have here in the Delaware. And so the game was take this out, restore the riparian corridor within this park, which is above this dam. And here is the park as it existed, a walled-in mill pond up above. And you can see here in the lower right how shallow this water is because of the silt that's filled in behind this dam. And so the Corps of Engineers removed the dam and removed all of this wall along here. And I worked with one of the Corps of Engineers biologists to do specifications for plant material. The Corps had purview over the immediate riparian corridor right adjacent to the stream and the stream proper. These are rock veins that were put in again to help control the flows. And Olin, which is a internationally recognized landscape architecture planning firm headquartered in Philadelphia, had purview over the rest of this park on the east side and the west side to put in park amenities. And I worked as a subcontractor to Olin on this project. So this was after the park proper beyond the riparian corridor was put in. This area of large stones going down to the river, which you can't see here below view. This area of large stones was called the staircase, the grand staircase, and was an area where people could come and sit and do contemplative things along the edge of the river. This is a late afternoon shot looking upriver a couple years after this was completed. Another early evening shot from the west side looking upstream. This was, that was in June. This was in September. Native grasses and wildflowers doing really well here. This area back here, kind of mauve colored, is Joe Pye weed. And here I am being contemplative along the grand staircase. And down here at the bottom end of the view of the river, this is where the dam was. So completely different. And this is a pretty cool park right in the middle of downtown Stamford. And as you might expect on a bigger river like this, you get bigger things. Great blue herons regularly along here, great egrets, the white heron. And there were even osprey that would dive into the pools along this river while people were in the park and catch fish. Very cool. And lastly, just to show you that restoration can take place at almost any scale, this is Mannington Mills, a floor manufacturer with a more than 100-year history in South Jersey, there in Salem, New Jersey. This is their headquarters building, built in around 1960. And as the architecture dictated at the time, they had this huge concrete plaza here that was totally featureless, no plants, no nothing. And it was a hot and unwelcoming place. And they decided they wanted to redo this plaza in a more environmentally friendly way. And because they were located on a tidal marsh in South Jersey, I suggested that they do a miniature watershed on their plaza. And so they thought that was a pretty neat idea, and they agreed to do that. So this is construction of a watershed on the plaza. There are two real water features here. The idea was that the tidal marsh that occurs on their site originates in the Piedmont, with water flowing from the Piedmont onto the coastal plain and ultimately into a tidal stream that's on their property and into the tidal marsh. So the idea was to try and mimic that at a small scale. And so there were two real water features. This was one of them. So this is Piedmont area 1, and there's another Piedmont area over here on the left side that's going to go in with a real water feature. And then those are going to coalesce into a tidal stream that is mimicked with blue tile that will flow throughout the site. So here we are, Piedmont here on the left, another Piedmont here, and these are both recirculating water features. And then here's our tidal stream as it flows through the entire plaza. And this is what it looked like a year after it was planted. It says oak leaf hydrangea here, all native plants, eastern redbud, lots of wetland loving plants, some sedges. And here's one of the water features flowing out into the tidal marsh here. And this is very small scale stuff, so you get small scale things. Ebony jewelwing is a type of damselfly, closely related to dragonflies that are associated with water. We did get some hummingbirds using this plaza, feeding on some of the, like this Monarda bee balm. And here's where the Piedmont flows into the tidal marsh. And here's our other segment of Piedmont up here. And here's the tidal marsh area. And rather than using wetland plants here, since it was going to be a maintenance nightmare if we tried to go with something like Spartina alterniflora, which is the marsh grass you see in true tidal marshes. This is little blue stem, beautiful native warm season grass, and some small shrubs and lots of wildflowers. And the Mannington liked this area so much, they ended up putting speakers out here and piping water music out into the plaza. And their employees would come out here on their breaks and at lunchtime, and it was a very popular place to visit. And again, a community of animals commensurate with the size of the ecosystem. It's a great spangled fritillary. And there was basically an insect assemblage there from leafhoppers, which eat leaves, the eastern tiger swallowtail, which is a nectar feeder and pollinator, to this guy over here, which is a bad boy predator. That is an assassin bug. And that proboscis is used to stab prey and inject protease, which turns the prey into a milkshake, which they then drink. So you don't mess with these things. And lastly, all of us live in watersheds. We may live in different watersheds, but we live in somebody's watershed, and it's our watershed. And as landowners within watersheds, we end up by default being stewards of our watershed. So what are some things you can do on your own property to improve your watershed? Well, for many of us, the first thing is mow less lawn. How much lawn are you mowing? If you're mowing more than an acre or two, maybe you don't need to mow more than an acre or two. There are properties, for example, if you go to Pipersville and make a left turn and drive down 313, 413, my bad, and head farther south, you'll pass by some areas where there's 20 or 30 acres of lawn being mowed on some estates along the left side of the road, on the east side of the road. And I would argue that that's just unnecessary, especially if you're fertilizing it. So give some thought to, are there areas on your property where you can mow less lawn? And particularly if you have an intermittent stream or a perennial stream on your property or a pond, are you mowing right up to the edge of it? Do you need to mow all the way up to the edge of it? Can you leave a vegetated buffer? Can you simply stop mowing? Or can you plant something like some of the warm season grasses that we were looking at, or wildflowers, and build a little buffer, because vegetated buffers work well to filter runoff from your lawn that may go into your pond or go into a stream that's close by. Could you add woody plantings? As I mentioned earlier, the best runoff coefficients, the lowest runoff coefficients, are in forests. Forests are great at absorbing runoff and recycling water. They're the best thing for it. So if you have a big open area that you could do some woody plantings, and of course in our area protect them from deer for a while until they get started, that's a really good thing to do. What about infiltration? Is water, do you have impervious surfaces, your driveway, for example? There are lots of places in the township where people have long driveways. We have a long driveway. Ours doesn't happen to cross a water body, but some people have access to their property across a stream. Is your driveway paved? Does the water run off the driveway and in a mowed area right into a drainage channel or into a water body? Can you do an infiltration structure? If you go online and look up infiltration, you can find details for infiltration trenches, which are fairly easy to construct. You can put them at the edge of your driveway. If your driveway drains off into a natural area or even to your lawn, there are things you can do there. And of course, I mentioned the rain gardens earlier. You can easily find diagrams and specifications for how to build a rain garden. Or rooftop runoff is fairly clean. You can collect your rooftop runoff in a rain barrel. And in the summer, if you have plants around on a patio, for example, rather than having to water them repeatedly when we get dry weather inevitably in August and September, you can take water from your rain barrel and recycle that water by watering your plants with it. So just some food for thought for things that you might be able to do on your own property to do enhancement work. And at this point, I will turn it back to Kelly, and maybe we'll get to some questions. So let me see how I can escape from here. Can you retake control, Kelly, or do I need to do something?
You're all good, Jeff. I have full control.
All righty.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was fantastic. Tons of information. That was great. I absolutely loved it. Congratulations. Well done. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Currently, we do not have any questions or comments in the chat box. I will remind everyone listening that if you have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please throw that into the chat box. If you don't know how to open the chat box, you can use your mouse to go to the bottom of your screen. You should see a range of icons that pop up at the bottom of your screen. The chat box is in the middle. You can click on that and type into the box to everyone if you have something you'd like to say or a question you'd like to ask. I will wait a moment to see if anyone has anything they'd like to. Okay, Michelle Costner has a question. Michelle, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask that question out loud. And if you can't, I will unmute you for you. And I can unmute for you, or we can just do it in the chat box.
It's actually Wayne Costner. Um, but Michelle is my lovely wife. We have runoff down the side of our property and was thinking about a rain garden, but have the concern that would be running next to the septic field and the potential impact of negatively impacting the septic system.
Is the drainage that you're talking about, typically the septic fields are in mounds these days?
No, we're traditional at this point.
Okay. Is there any way to do infiltration farther up gradient, or are you?
Potentially.
That's probably what I would suggest. Is the drainage right now? Do you get running water in this channel?
Yeah, with storms we do.
Okay, but it's not impacting your drainage system right now.
No, well, it drains out to the road and then away from the property.
You can set up an infiltration trench there with a sand underlay and perforated pipe wrapped in geosynthetic material, and you would get infiltration through the sand into the underlying soil. And if there's too much water, it would continue, and you can discharge it further down gradient back into the channel.
Okay.
So if you have enough grade in the channel, you can bury it, you can do the trench, and then you can kind of have the trench grade back into the channel, so that if you're getting infiltration in the up gradient section, that's fine. Or if you're at the bottom end, bypassing your septic system, if the lower portion of your drainage bypasses the septic system, you could do the infiltration down there.
Yeah, that's a potential solution. Well, thank you very much, and also thank you for the presentation.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Thank you. Great question. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments? Don't want to end this if people have questions or comments they'd like to make. Jeff, if you have opened your chat window, you have received kudos from a lot of people that I would like you to be able to see.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
So we have a question from Kevin. Kevin, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask that question.
Hi, it's Sue.
Oh,
Kevin
hi.
is my lovely husband. I was just wondering, a lot of times you hear about construction projects, and you showed us a lot about them, and they need to replace a wetlands or move a wetlands, and we create these wetlands. And I've always wondered, are we doing as good a job as nature does, or do they end up being as effective as a naturally occurring wetlands?
To date, the short answer is no. And for several reasons, but the main one is the first thing I said about wetland construction. It's hydrology. Typically, constructed wetlands end up being drier than natural wetlands. And so you don't get the same diversity of plant material, because the stresses of dry periods are greater. Sometimes the soils aren't as good that are used. In constructing the wetland, the soil gets compacted. So now you increasingly see specifications, construction specifications that say basically you have to use equipment with a very light footprint, or you have to dig up the soil on your way out so that it's not so compacted. Because I've seen wetlands constructed and this is more typical even of basins where you try to do naturalization in a basin, that the last thing the contractor does, these construction guys want everything to look nice and level, and they run compaction equipment over it. That's the last thing they do. So one of the great things about that compost that I showed you is that it helps the soil be more friable and more loamy. And so it holds water better, and it's great for growing plants. But the answer to your question is that research to date indicates that man-made wetlands don't work as well as natural wetlands, and it's mostly due to water.
Right. Thank you. Thanks
Yep.
very much.
Thank you, Sue. That was a great question. Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I'm glad you asked that. And Jeff, good answer. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments that anyone would like to make before we close this out and thank everyone? And Jesse and Vladimir, are you looking to ask a question? You need to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask the question.
It's easier.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
That's not Jesse, and that's not Vladimir.
Wait, that was somebody else that unmuted themselves.
You want to say something?
Unless that's Vladimir Bud.
That was a mistake. Jesse, Vladimir, would you like to say something? We can't hear you if you're speaking. You want to use the chat window?
Okay, now go ahead.
Kelly, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, boys.
Okay. Jeff, wonderful presentation. When you showed that photograph of the dam, I forget where it was. No,
Stamford, Connecticut.
My question is, first of all, how did the Corps of Engineers remove the dam? Just a couple of sentences on that. And then secondly, what did you see happen with the fish once the dam was removed and they could move right upstream? I assume there was no fish steps or anything in that dam.
No. First answer to the question, very interesting. They put in massive steel sheet pile and separated the river into two halves. And they took out one half of the dam and then routed the river through the half that they had taken out. And then they took out the other half and then they removed the sheet pile.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the answer to your question is, as far as I know, I think they have seen salmon go upstream since the dam was taken out.
And that dam's been there for how many years?
My recollection was that I heard someone say that it had been there for a couple hundred years, but that seems like an overly long time. But it's been there for quite a long time.
But
that's an ongoing effort throughout New England, is to take these low head dams out to try and get Atlantic salmon populations back on board with using these rivers again.
So you were sitting there contemplating all sorts.
I was contemplating what a neat environment I was sitting in that a few years ago had been pretty anthropomorphized.
Great story. Great story.
Thanks.
Jesse and Vladimir, I'm going to give you another chance if you'd like to speak or use the chat box. If you don't know where the chat box is, you can use your mouse to go to the bottom of your screen. Hopefully when you mouse at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple of icons show up at the bottom, and chat is one of them. Jesse, say something. I want to see if I can hear you. No, okay. Unfortunately, I think your microphone is not working. Tell you what, Jesse, you have my email address. Since it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to get you in chat, if you have a question, please feel free to email me. We'll get your question answered. Can I interest anyone else in questions or comments before we say goodnight? Well, then, thank you all very, very much. It was great to see you all here. I hope you enjoyed Jeff's presentation. I certainly did. Hope you learned something. I certainly did. I always do. And I hope to see you all again on our next lecture. Will be in March. Karen, I'm going to unmute you for a second. If you would please tell us, if you could please remind us the date of our next lecture.
Oh, you've got me. I don't-
Sorry.
Oh.
Hold on, I have it in front of me. I'm gonna look it up. It is March 25th.
26?
March 25th to 5.
Right, and our person who's running that is a self-taught naturalist who has the most beautiful photography. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, Marianne Bourge, because her photography, and we'll still see it and it'll be beautiful, but she talks all about the importance of plants and what they do for human beings, for insects, and how the whole chain works, and pollination and all the things that hopefully we're getting ready to get excited about at the end of winter. I highly recommend it. She's got beautiful, beautiful photography and a message to all of us about how important it is to have natural areas.
It says mute. Is there any?
There we go.
There you go.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Are we unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Oh,
Okay.
wow, go for it.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to ask about was the feeling of you all about this imminent destruction that PennDOT has proposed on the Sheep Hole Bridge and the subsequent damage to the downstream conserved properties that will occur when PennDOT tries to put in their massive 2-lane highway bridge there. That seems to be, and the damage to the Tinicum watershed. And it seems to me that the Conservancy should have a position on protecting those properties there and should somehow be making a public statement about that. That's my question. Okay.
We don't hear you.
We don't hear you now.
No, we don't hear you.
That's all right. I muted myself. I just said thank you for your question. I'm going to toss that to Jeff for the moment.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
The presentation, excellent.
Yeah.
We enjoyed it.
Good. The Conservancy, I believe, has taken a position. They're concerned about potential damage downstream. I think the problem is that both the concerned citizens who are objecting to the PennDOT bridge and PennDOT are both basing their take on what the result will be in terms of the flow of the stream and its potential change in position in the channel or potential erosive forces that are already evident downstream next to Camp Galil, for example. Each side is basing their interpretation on different models. And those models have different assumptions. And I'm not familiar with either of the models. I haven't reviewed them. But all models of stream flow have underlying assumptions about what's going to happen under different flow conditions and different channel configurations and so forth. And I just totally have not ever reviewed what those assumptions are and how those models are interpreted. And so I'm really not in a position to offer you an opinion on what one configuration is going to do versus another configuration. The Conservancy, I personally and the Conservancy are well aware that there are concerns, and especially given PennDOT's history on some prior projects, there's a concern about what's going to happen on this one. And my own personal opinion is that the engineers from both sides should get together in a room and go over their models and discuss their models and figure out whether the assumptions that underlie either model are the appropriate ones, and what can they do to compromise so that the project can be moved forward. Because obviously it's been a concern for a long time, and there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about it. And I don't know how long it's been, 8 or 10 years, and the bridge is still hasn't been upgraded. And I recognize there's a great desire to use the materials from the original bridge, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. Use the materials from the original bridge to make whatever revised bridge or new bridge, make it look like the old bridge so that it maintains the character. As far as the what's actually going to happen when the bridge is redone or reconfigured and moved slightly, I guess it's slightly downstream is the proposal. All of those predictions are based on models, and models have underlying assumptions. And the question is whether the assumptions are met for the particular model that's being used and how close they are to reality. And I can't comment on that. I'm not familiar with the models. So that's the best I can offer you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And I am going to call this a night. We're now going on 9 p.m. Thank you all so very much for joining us. Look for our advertisements and social media, our website, local newspapers, and probably a web blast from us as well for our next series of lectures. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a lovely evening. And I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks,
Bye.
Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Fair.
Bye.